Before moving on, let's review some of the key ideas about ritual and gender relations that we've seen in our course materials. As we have seen, rituals in different cultures often have highly gendered content, but the ideas about gender displayed, dramatized, and reinforced in these rituals can be quite different. Here, I offer a summary and analysis of our different sources, and I'm eager to see what types of conclusions you reach in your own papers. First, as regards Morocco, Cohn-Schilling's chapter on etching patriarchal rule outlines how first marriage rituals in Morocco train men and women into roles that will be expected of them as adults. Specifically, grooms learn assertiveness and authority, and brides learn passivity and submission. It's important to note that these behavioral styles do have to be learned at this stage because during childhood, boys, quote, have been trained in subordinates, and girls are often independent and forceful. The groom is instructed in dominance by being ritually transformed into the king for the duration of the wedding ceremonies. At public prayer grounds, he is, quote, dressed in the monarch's clothing, surrounded by a court of advisors, and called by the monarch's favored titles, end quote. Henna dye is a common symbol of blood, and in the Quran, conception is depicted as occurring through the combination of the husband's sperm and the wife's blood. In the Moroccan weddings, henna is mixed with raw eggs. The groom puts his hand in the dye, enters the empty nuptial chamber, and stamps his handprint on the bedroom wall several times to indicate how many children he wants to have. At that point, even though the bride is not present, they are considered married. Through this action, which represents the creation of life through the spilling of the wife's blood, the groom receives training in his adult role of assertiveness, even aggression. In contrast, in the bride's portion of the ceremonies, she is trained into passivity and submission. While the groom's ceremonies are public, hers are private. For several hours, she sits perfectly still in a private room in which typically only other women are present. Henna dye is applied in elaborate filigree patterns to her hands and feet. She then heats her hands and feet over coals to fix the dye, and her hands and feet are wrapped in gauze for a half day or more, during which time she is, quote, completely dependent on others, end quote. The bride is then carried to the bridal chamber, disrobed, and laid on the bed. When the groom enters the chamber, he greets the bride with a symbol of physical dominance, such as breaking her headdress or placing his sword on her shoulder. After the groom breaks the bride's hymen, the blood on her clothing or sheets is publicly displayed as a sign of the groom's power to create life through the combination of his sperm and his wife's blood. In conclusion, we can see that through their different ceremonies, Moroccan grooms and brides are being trained into distinctive gender roles and relations, with grooms learning dominance and brides learning submission. In the documentary film A Living Goddess in Kathmandu, we see a more complex and nuanced set of gender relations emerging out of the ritual practices. On the one hand, we see a multitude of goddesses and temples dedicated to goddesses. We learn that the goddesses are considered powerful as they bestow blessings such as good health, fertility, safety, wealth, and agricultural abundance. We learn that the goddesses are built into the spatial structure of the city, as legend has it that a goddess instructed the king where and how to build the city, and now 8 guardian goddesses protect the site. We see that the guardian deity of Nepal's royal family is a goddess, Kumari. She is worshipped as a living goddess, and a young girl is selected to perform the role of Kumari's living manifestation. Although the monarchy was abolished in 2008, shortly after this film was made, the analysis of gender roles is still useful. When this film was made, the high priest to the royal family's main duty was to mediate between Nepal's king and the goddesses. He says that male and female are complementary, and the king cannot rule without the help of the goddesses. This reverence for goddesses also filters down into attitudes about human women and girls. For example, Newaris believe that goddess-like power is found in girls. However, while male and female are complementary, nevertheless, males occupy a higher position both among gods and among humans. The Nepali king was considered a god, and he was the highest-ranking human. This photo is of Nepal's final king. The Bharatayegu ceremony performed by Newari girls also reveals that female is subordinated to male. Prior to their first menstruation, Newari girls participate in the Bharatayegu ceremony, which is said to prepare them for their roles as adult women. They enter confinement for 12 days, during which they are not allowed to see even a ray of sunlight or any men. They are instructed by adult relatives to, quote, be quiet and well behaved, end quote, and to, quote, never shout or cry, end quote. During the confinement, they wear special makeup to emphasize their beauty. At the end of the 12-day period, the first thing they are supposed to see is the sun, because at that moment, they will be symbolically married to the sun god, who is male. This prepares their bodies to bear children. At the end of the ceremony in the film, the young girl Sonika says, quote, I can't hope to be like a real goddess, but I want to be a woman who respects her parents, and I want to be useful to others, end quote. Although the message of male-female complementarity is very strong throughout the Nepalese culture and respect for females is very high, nonetheless, males still occupy the most powerful roles both in the world of the gods and in the world of humans. The Bharatayegu ritual prepares girls for that secondary and submissive role. Turning our attention to medieval England, the rituals shown in the television episode about marriage in the limited series Medieval Lives reveal a great deal about gender relations at that time. We see that women had a somewhat subordinate role, and parents, who were eager to maintain a good social standing, and the Catholic Church, anxious about the sin of fornication, sought to control women's romantic liaisons by controlling wedding ceremonies. However, we also see that the coexistence of two types of weddings gave women a certain degree of control over their fates. I'll explain what I mean. In medieval England, there were two types of wedding ceremonies. The first was very informal. Young women and men could become married by simply holding one another's right hands and saying, I take you for my wife or husband. No church officials or even witnesses were needed to make the marriage valid. The second type of ceremony, which took place in the church building and was officiated by a priest, was more formal. This ceremony emerged as the church went through a period of wholesale reform in the 12th century, and marriage was designated as one of the 7 sacraments. Fornication, or sex outside of marriage, was considered a grave sin and was punished with public whippings. The proper consummation of the marriage was ensured in the way that the priest followed the newlyweds into the wedding chamber, where he performed the final part of the wedding ceremony. The church marriage was considered unbreakable. The only way that people could be granted an annulment of their marriage by an ecclesiastical court was through proving infidelity, excessive cruelty, that they were too closely related, that the husband was impotent, or that one of the partners had already been married through one of those informal wedding ceremonies. In the episode, we see hints that the coexistence of these two types of ceremonies created opportunities for women to take some control over their fate. In one instance, we learn that a young woman named Marjorie Paston secretly married a man of whom her mother disapproved. The mother, in a nouveau riche family, was very anxious about their social station and did not want her daughter to be married to the son of a shopkeeper. Although her mother dragged her before the bishop to investigate and invalidate this earlier marriage, Marjorie insisted that the marriage was entered into freely and was therefore valid. She was therefore able to successfully resist the pressures put on her by her mother and the church. In another instance, a young woman named Agnes Huntington also married a young man secretly, despite her family's approval. Similarly, her mother attempted to have the union invalidated in ecclesiastical court. After putting up a fight with her mother for a year, Agnes relented and apparently recanted and married in the church a man of whom her mother approved. However, after suffering his cruelty, Agnes Huntington attempted to have the marriage annulled by reviving her story about her prior marriage. We might conclude that the informal type of wedding ritual, rather than always being an instrument of social control, in some instances became a way for women to assert agency and enjoy love matches of their own choosing. Our final source for this topic, Cynthia Dickel Dunn's Cultural Models and Metaphors for Marriage, reveals that people in different cultural settings may have very different expectations for relations between wives and husbands in the context of marriage. Dunn analyzed speeches at Japanese weddings. She found many similarities with American expectations, but also significant differences. Japanese marriages have changed quite a bit over the past century, from the time when the primary function of marriage was the maintenance of the lineage through the creation and raising of children and the exchange of labor to reproduce the household. Then, marriages were typically arranged by the parents, and emotional attachment and intimacy were downplayed. More recently, while many couples may meet through a matchmaker, they also expect to feel love before marriage. Analysis of the metaphors in the speeches revealed that modern Japanese, like Americans, think of marriage as a shared journey, a union that is greater than the sum of its parts, and something that they build together through combined efforts. However, the greatest differences were found in the ways in which Japanese spoke about the work of a marriage and the couple's emotions. Previous research revealed that Americans think about emotional satisfaction as the primary goal of a marriage. Correspondingly, when Americans talk about work and marriage, they talk about working on the relationship or trying to strengthen the emotional bond, especially through communication. In contrast, the Japanese speeches did not elaborate very much on the emotional qualities of marriage. When they did, they typically talked about how the emotions of love and trust within the couple would help them express compassion and love towards other people in society. When they talked about work in the marriage, they talked about cooperating to achieve their goals and to work to serve and to be generous towards others in society. The emotional bond was envisioned as an element that could serve as the foundation for the couple's cooperation on shared tasks and in their relationships with others. While American marriages are focused inward on the couple's intimacy, Japanese marriages are focused outward towards cooperation on tasks and good relations with others in society. To wrap this all up, gender is organized very differently in different cultural systems with various combinations, styles, and nuances. It is frequently contested, challenged, and reimagined. Because of its rich capacity for symbolic display and embodiment, ritual is often the staging ground for the negotiation, experimentation, and institutionalization of gender and gender relations.